Doctor, please remain standing. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated. Please state your name for the record. Spell your first and last names.
Stephen Lewis Shafer, Stephen, S-T-E-V-E-N, Shafer, S-H-A-F-E-R.
Dr. Shafer, good morning. Let me provide you with some instructions. First of all, we'll provide you with a cup for the water. We don't like to advertise. So you'll be able to pour the water into the cup. No, that's all right. You can just put it down to the side. This way, people's view is not distracted. Now to the real important directions. Please sit back and relax. Please speak loudly so we can hear you. You can face front and the jurors. If you're called upon to provide a yes or no answer, please answer yes or no rather than the slang which can be tricky. And lastly, please wait until you hear an entire question before you answer it. In our daily lives, many of us are used to talking over each other. It's routine. But in a courtroom, it's important to have the full question asked and then respond. Is that all okay?
Very clear, thank you.
Thank you. Direct, please, by the people. Mr. Walgren.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
What do you do for a living?
I'm an anesthesiologist.
And what is an anesthesiologist?
An anesthesiologist is a physician, graduated from medical school, and then spent 3 years in training to learn the specialized skills of anesthesia. An anesthesiologist is responsible for, the classic view is that we anesthetize patients for surgery. But what we actually do is really perioperative medicine. We assess patients prior to surgery. During surgery, we don't not just keep them asleep, but we're actually responsible for keeping them alive. We're responsible for their vital signs, responsible for the circulation and everything. After surgery, we are often responsible for them when they go to the critical care unit. So critical care is one of the subdisciplines of anesthesia. And because we're very much involved in pain management as part of our practice, many anesthesiologists are focused on pain management as well.
We're going to try to speak just a little bit slower.
Sorry.
That's all right. All of us. Mr. Walgren?
Thank you. And in regard to you being a medical doctor and specifically an anesthesiologist, can you tell us a little bit about your current academic titles and positions that you hold?
Yes. I'm a professor of anesthesiology at Columbia University. I'm an adjunct professor of anesthesia at Stanford University. And I am an adjunct professor of bioengineering and therapeutic sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, in the School of Pharmacy.
And as far as being a professor of anesthesiology at Columbia University, how long have you had that position?
I started in 2007.
And in regard to being a professor of anesthesia at Stanford University in California, how long have you had that position?
I joined the Stanford faculty in 1987 and remained on faculty as an assistant professor, then as an associate professor, and I became a tenured professor at Stanford. I believe the year was 2000.
And as far as being an adjunct professor of bioengineering and therapeutic sciences at University of California, San Francisco, what is the class that you teach there?
There is a class, a graduate level class in what's called pharmacometrics, which is the science that relates how you give a drug to the concentrations and then what happens in the patient. And I teach in that class, which is the nature of that appointment.
And the science, you indicated the science of when you give a drug, and what did you follow that up with?
I'll work on speaking slowly. Pharmacometrics is a branch of science that deals with mathematical models to relate the dose of drug to the concentration of drug in the body, and then to relate the concentration of drug in the body to what the drug actually does. It's been a discipline that has grown for about the last 50 years and has grown somewhat explosively in the last 20 years with advent of modern digital computing power.
And this science, pharmacometrics, that helps determine dosages and what dose is effective and the et cetera?
Absolutely. Pharmacometrics is one of the core competencies of every pharmaceutical company because they're expected to put together mathematical models that explain how when you get a certain dose of a drug, how your body responds in a certain way. And companies have to understand this in order to develop drugs at the right dose and then bring them to the market at a dose that's effective without also being toxic. So it's a core competency of every pharmaceutical company. It is a core competency of the Food and Drug Administration. I'm sorry. Core competency of every pharmaceutical company. And it's also a core competency of the Food and Drug Administration. And it's incorporated into every label for every drug that the Food and Drug Administration comes forward with.
And those labels then can help doctors serve as guidelines for doctors to now know what the appropriate dosage is and things of that nature.
That's absolutely the point. That's absolutely correct. The purpose of the label is to guide the physician on how to use the drug safely and minimize toxicity. And pharmacometrics is the science that provides the numbers, the quantitative numbers that are used.
And in the end, when you say to minimize toxicity, what you're really saying is to minimize injury to the patient.
Absolutely.
Now, the Columbia University, Stanford University, and the University of California, San Francisco, is it fair to say those are among the top 3 medical schools in the country?
They're up there on most such lists, yes.
Okay, and you hold professorships at each of those 3?
Correct.
Now, you also are an editor-in-chief of a prominent anesthesia journal, is that correct?
Correct.
And what journal is that?
The journal is called Anesthesia and Analgesia, and it's the largest medical journal in the field of anesthesiology and perioperative medicine.
And as editor-in-chief, then, what do you do? What are your responsibilities as far as operating this anesthesia journal?
Well, I see every manuscript that is sent to the journal, and we get over 2,000 submissions every year. So I see 2,000 manuscripts come through. I personally screen the manuscripts for both merit and for integrity. For example, has any sign of plagiarism or any concerns about fraud. I then either handle the manuscripts myself, and I handle approximately a quarter of all submissions to the journal personally, or I assign them to a member of the editorial board. And we have an editorial board of 70 senior scientists and clinicians who handle manuscripts for the journal. Then they make decisions. The papers come back to me, and I review the decisions, and then we send the decisions to authors. Just by way of example, while I was waiting outside today, I handled 27 manuscripts. It's a treadmill that just goes on and on.
And when you say, excuse me, when you say manuscripts, what are we talking about? What is a manuscript?
Most manuscripts are research studies where someone has performed some sort of research relevant to anesthesiology or perioperative medicine, and they would like to see that paper, which used usually data, patient subjects, or maybe cell cultures, or very basic science, but they would like to see that paper appear in anesthesia and analgesia. We also have things like case reports, just odd things that happen that people think might be interesting.
Now, as editor-in-chief of this journal, you have an editorial board, you said, of about 70?
Correct.
Okay. And does Dr. Paul White, one of the defense experts in this case, serve on that editorial board?
Absolutely. Paul is currently if I may add.
Sure.
Paul is currently the section editor for the multimedia, book, and meeting reports, and is the former section editor for the section on ambulatory anesthesia as well.
And in your task as editor-in-chief and the review process that goes through these academic submissions, I assume a certain number are rejected as not meeting the standards of the Anesthesia and Analgesia Journal?
I actually run metrics every quarter, and our most recent statistics are that our acceptance rate for original research manuscripts is about 21%. So nearly 4 out of 5 papers get rejected.
And how much time would you say you spend a week on reviewing the latest research and the latest knowledge in your field of expertise as it relates to your job as the editor?
The editor-in-chief job consumes about 50 to 60 hours every week, including just these recent weeks that I've been preparing for this. So it consumes an enormous amount of time.
And in this review process of these submitted manuscripts, does this give you a very broad overview and informed knowledge of the current state of your practice in medicine?
I think so. We get papers from all over the world. We get papers from literally every country. And so we have some insight into what is happening, not just in the United States, but internationally. We see very much cutting-edge research where the trends are going. And we also find out about sort of the unusual cases, things that nobody ever thought might happen, and they'll send it. So the exposure is pretty broad.
Do you serve on any other editorial boards in addition to your work with anesthesia and analgesia?
I'm currently an editor on the editorial board of the British Journal of Anesthesia, and I'm an editor on the Journal of Anesthesia, which is a Japanese journal.
In the past, have you served on other editorial boards in this regard?
Yes. I've been on the pardon me. I've been on the editorial board of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. I've been on the editorial board of the Journal of Pharmacokinetics and Biopharmaceutics. I've been on the I have to look at my CV. But the answer is yes.
All right.
Sorry.
Dr. Shafer, could you describe your education that led you into this field?
That led me into this field would actually start with my pediatrician when I was about 9 years old. But the formal education, which you're asking for.
Please.
I was an undergraduate at Princeton University, and I graduated from Princeton University in 1978. I then went from Princeton to Stanford University for my MD degree. Graduated from Stanford in 1983.
I'm sorry, what was your degree from Princeton?
Biology, an AB degree, ours baccalaureate.
Okay, and then you were a medical student at Stanford University?
Correct.
And when did you graduate from
1983.
Okay.
Then from Stanford, I went to University of Pennsylvania for my training in anesthesiology. That was completed in 1986. I then returned to Stanford in 1986 for a fellowship in clinical pharmacology with Don Stansky, which ran from 1986 through 1987, and then an intermediate year from 1987 to 1988. Also with Don Stansky.
Thank you. Defense counsel had indicated in their opening statement to the jury that you were a student of Dr. White's, Dr. Paul White. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
You obviously know Dr.
Yes.
White and have worked with him in a
Oh, yes,
professional...
and my first wife, Audrey Shafer, was his fellow when I was a fellow with Don Stansky. So Audrey was Paul's fellow, and I was Don Stansky's fellow.
And how long have you known Dr. White? And by the way, this is a gentleman seated here behind me in court.
Yes. I've known Dr. White since, I believe, 1981. My first wife, Audrey Shafer, actually did a research year with Dr. White at the end of medical school. And so during that research year, I got to know Dr. White and his family and his children. And Dr. White and I have remained friends and colleagues ever since.
Now, you're familiar with the current dosing guidelines for propofol sedation?
Yes.
And did you, in fact, have a direct role in establishing or those current dosing guidelines for propofol sedation?
Absolutely.
And can you describe that, please?
In 1991, AstraZeneca, which at the time was called ICI Pharmaceuticals.
Could you spell that, please?
I'm sorry. AstraZeneca is ASTRAZENECA. And is the drug company that manufactures propofol. They wanted to get an indication, which means they wanted to get permission from the Food and Drug Administration to make propofol available for sedation. The FDA had had a very bad experience when a drug called midazolam was brought forward for sedation because the dosing guidelines were wrong and there were a lot of complications when midazolam was introduced for sedation. So the FDA was not anxious to repeat that experience for propofol.
When was that situation?
That situation about 1986 to about 1990.
Okay, and that was remedied as far as the midazolam?
As far as midazolam, that was remedied, yes.
Okay.
But because of that experience, the FDA was very concerned that they get this right, that the dosing guidelines be exactly correct. AstraZeneca had done a series of studies showing that propofol could be used for sedation, but the FDA said, well, what's the exact dose? And they said, well, we really can't tell from our studies. They said, well, I'm going too fast, I'm sorry.
Well, and we're passing out a tissue. Gesundheit. Just a moment. I want to make sure. Again, we're going to try to slow up things a tad.
All right.
So, the FDA...
back here.
The FDA was seeking to determine the proper dosage levels.
That is correct. And they had specific questions. One question was, what is the infusion rate of propofol to avoid complications?
And what do you mean by infusion rate?
So an infusion means that when you maintain a drug effect with a drug like propofol, it has to drip in so that every moment there's a little bit more drug going in, and the reason is because there's constantly drug being removed by the liver. So you have to have drug going in because drug is being removed by the liver. And that's what an infusion does. But AstraZeneca's reply was, we've tried various rates, and the FDA said, no, we don't want various rates. We want to know the rate. What's the best, safest rate? The other question was, how do you start sedation? Because if you start sedation too quickly, you can put your patient on a trajectory to toxicity. And so you don't want to start sedation too quickly because of the trajectory towards toxicity that you might embark on. So they said, well, how long do you wait? And AstraZeneca did not have data, so I did the analysis for that as well. So I did the analysis for the infusion rate, I did the analysis for the initiation of sedation, and they also said, what is a safe dose? I'm sorry. Wait, go back to where?
Dose.
I did the analysis for the infusion rate, thank you. And the analysis for the dose that would be given to start sedation.
And you designed this, I guess, dose?
Absolutely. It was all done with mathematical models based upon the data that they had. These models are all based on data. The other questions came up were things like, what is the reduction in elderly patients? The experience that the FDA had with midazolam is that many of the complications were in the elderly who would get a dose of midazolam and basically stop breathing. And they said, we want to know how much to reduce the dose. That had not been specifically addressed. So I did the analysis of the reduction in the elderly. So I was involved in almost all of the numbers that appear in the package insert for sedation are numbers that are derived from modeling that I did back in 1991.
I have a copy of an actual package insert as well as the same document, but in a bit larger text. At this time, I'd ask that the actual package insert document, which is a 4-page document, be marked People's Next. I believe it's 211.
It is.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Dr. Shafer, showing you what was just marked Peoples 211. Let me, do you recognize this first page of this document?
Absolutely.
And is this a package insert for propofol that would be contained within every package of propofol
That is
sold?
correct.
Yes?
Yes.
And can you just tell us, what is Diprivan as it relates to the word propofol? What do those two different words mean?
For drugs that are brought to market, there are usually two names. One name is a chemical name, and no matter who makes the drug, the chemical name is the same so that doctors actually know what they're giving. And in this case, the chemical name is propofol. The other name is a trade name. The company was allowed to come up with their own name, as long as the name is not misleading in some fashion. And that's the name that they sell the drug. So in this case, the name is Diprivan. I would just say it's a little teeny bit different, because Diprivan is actually propofol and something called an emulsion. It's the white stuff. It's actually fat. And the emulsions actually can differ a little bit. So in the case of propofol, it is important to specify the manufacturer's name, because they may have mixed it with a slightly different fat solution.
Thank you. And looking then at page let me ask you before I get to the specific pages, did you do specific work and make specific contributions to the package insert for propofol?
Absolutely. Actually, if you scroll down, you can get to it.
What is this here, Dr. Shafer?
So this is a graph that I made on my computer in 1992, and that's the only source of this. This was done in conjunction with Dan Spiker at the Food and Drug Administration, and it relates to the use of propofol infusions in the intensive care unit. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong date. This went in with the ICU sedation, not the max sedation, and that was 1996, I think. So this is for ICU sedation, not max sedation. But the question that came up is, how long can a patient get propofol in the intensive care unit and still wake up quickly? And it depends on how much drug is given. If you give propofol for 1 hour, you get the lower curve that you can see there. If you give propofol for 10 hours, you have a slower washout. If you give propofol for 10 days, you have yet a slower washout. Although the point that was made by this graph is that as long as you're giving the propofol appropriately, even after 10 days of administration, take a look at the lower axis. It's called minutes. Minutes after the end of the infusion, even after 10 days of administration, the drug will go away in a few minutes after you turn off the infusion. That's the nature of propofol. And this was to guide clinicians. It was also intended as a warning to clinicians to not overdose. If you take that little graph there, the very last line that kind of parallels the word awakening, that curve that comes down right below and parallels the word awakening.
Dr. Shafer, do you have a laser pointer?
I didn't bring one with me now. Oh, there's here. I'm sorry, yes. Okay.
Yes,
All right. Okay. This curve right here, the notion was you go from a level of 1 during your sedation, pretty good level, reasonable level for sedation, down to about 0.5 and you wake up. As long as that's what you're doing, you can wake up in here. Look at this. This is just about 25, 30 minutes. So you'll wake up quickly. But look how flat this curve is. If you're off a little bit and you're giving too much drug, it can actually extend to hours. So you have to titrate carefully. If you titrate precisely, you wake up here, just a few minutes. But if you miss it, this curve is so flat that it doesn't cross until somewhere around here that you actually wake up. So you have to, even with long infusions, titrate very carefully.
And this graph that we're looking at that is contained within the propofol package, is that an example of the modeling type work that you're involved with?
Absolutely. I did this graph. This is all based upon mathematical models that are anchored in research data. So the models are anchored in research data. But those models allowed me to do this calculation to provide dosing guidelines, which 15 years later are still in use.
Thank you. I have the same document, but just in a larger font. May this be marked People's 212, Your Honor?
It is.
Dr. Shafer, do you recognize People's 212?
Yes, I think I do.
Okay. And this is actually the text of the package insert that we're looking here.
Correct.
People's 211?
Correct.
So in addition to this modeling chart that you created, what was that, about 20 years ago?
I think it was 1996, so about 15 years ago.
Going to